There is something living in Flathead National Forest, and it isn't human. Written by Red Plaid Hat. It started over 20 years ago when my family bought the farm. A cozy little house off of Highway 206. A little out of the way for privacy, but close enough to town for emergencies. My dad loved it. Called it his little piece of heaven. It shares a border with the Flathead National Forest, and I spent a lot of my free time climbing trees and building forts. In the winter, I'd dig snow tunnels from the house to the woods with various huts in between. It was everything that a kid could ask for. We had only been there 2 growing seasons when my mother started acting strange. She kept saying something was watching her at night from the forest. Something that she couldn't see, but that she knew was there. My dad didn't believe her at first, and neither did I. I had spent so much time in those woods that I would have known if something was there. She was adamant, though, and it got to a point where she didn't go outside after 2 in the afternoon. She said it was because that's when the shadows started to reach out from the depths of the trees. Her condition grew to be so bad that my dad was calling in doctors to check on her, but they weren't any help. She moved down to the basement and we had to take food down to her. Food that would go uneaten and spoil. She refused to sleep, and I could hear her at night talking to nothing. Muttering about what she thought was out there. Dad had moved me into his room after she moved into the basement. At the time, he said that it was because he didn't like being in the big room by himself. It wasn't until later that I realized that it was because he feared for my safety. Dad and I woke up to an extreme chill one winter morning. It felt like the furnace had been off for days, that sort of cold. I remember hearing the front door creaking and Dad grabbing his gun. He told me to stay put while he went to take a look. He shouted when it was all clear, and I followed his voice to the living room. Every window and door was open, and my mother was gone. Dad made a mad rush to relight the furnace. He was worried that the pipes had had a chance to freeze and would burst. I was in charge of closing all the windows and doors. He was downstairs when I found a bloody shard of glass on the porch and a trail of red footprints leading towards the forest. Mom had finally lost her mind. Dad called the cops and a search party was formed. They looked for 3 days, even calling in the Forest Service to do some aerial sweeps of the area. Everyone came up empty-handed. The sheriff didn't seem surprised that we didn't find her, and my dad was furious that he was giving up so soon. Sometimes the forest takes what it wants, and most of the time it doesn't give it back. It's the way that it has always been, the sheriff said. This is the only thing that I remember him saying before he packed up the rest of his gear and left. My dad drank heavily for a long time after that. The light that had been in his life was now extinguished, and he was just going through the motions. The harvests were good. We would go out every fall and harvest the hay and chamomile. Dad continued to drink, but there was money coming in, and we bought some cows and chickens. He didn't start to lose it until I went to college on the other side of the state. I didn't realize how bad he had gotten until the sheriff called me one night, asking me to come home to see him. Apparently, Dad had driven down to the bar, gun in hand. He had started shouting about getting even with whoever or whatever had taken his wife. I let my department head know, and I drove home at 3 a.m. in a panic. He didn't look like my dad when I picked him up at the station. His face was gaunt and his eyes were wild. His hands and coat were covered in blood. the origin of which I would discover when I took him home. The chickens were dead. He said that it had come for him, that it had come from the woods, and that it was tall and pale with distended limbs with multiple joints. When he had first seen it, he thought that it had been a tree swaying in the wind, until he found its eyes in the darkness. Those eyes, those eyes, he cried as I tucked a blanket around his feet. His gaze never left the back door. He said he had watched it walk up the trail that led from the woods to our porch, and he had sat there watching. He said, "It looks like a tree, Martin. They look like trees, but they ain't trees. They ain't trees." He finally calmed down and was able to get a little bit of rest for a while. I made a pot of coffee and I flipped through the farm's logbook. The last coherent entry was from 2 months prior. He talked about the harvest, about how something seemed to spook the cows, how 2 of the seasonal workers he'd hired had left for lunch and never come back. He mentioned seeing a human figure moving in the forest and how he planned on investigating it once he finished his dinner. I could feel the desperation in his writing, that he hoped that it was my mother, and that she'd finally come back to him. I had come to the terms with the fact that she was gone, but apparently he had not. "Why did you kill the chickens?" I asked. It actually was more of a statement rather than a question. He seemed to have come out of the mania that he'd been in the prior night, and I was hoping for some answers. I was hoping that he'd tell me that a coyote or a mountain lion was to blame, but the look that he gave me across the table struck me with unease. "I'm trying to feed it so that she comes back. It won't need her anymore if I feed it. The cows are next if need be," he said. Now, it wasn't what he said, but how he said it that didn't seem to sit right with me. Now, don't get me wrong, it was crazy to say that at all. But he said it as if we were discussing something that he'd read in the paper. "Dad, she's not out there, and if she is, she isn't alive," I said. I tried to maintain my calm, but I felt the air get tense, and he firmly set down his cup of coffee. "Do not talk back to me, boy," he yelled, and he slammed his fist on the table and then pushed his chair back. Picking up his keys, he said, "I will not be patronized in my own house. If you ain't gonna help me, then get out." That was the last time that I saw my father. His truck was found a couple of days later. It was caked in a layer of snow and parked along Highway 206. The keys were still in the ignition. The sheriff conducted a 3-day search and came up with nothing. And I was told in a hush to take care of my father's affairs. I put my education on permanent hold and I resigned myself to spend the rest of the year combing through his papers. 2 nights after the search, I woke up in a freezing cold house. It was so familiar. I cautiously walked into the living room. Every door and every window stood open to the night air. The power was out, but the fresh snow reflected enough light from the full moon that I was able to see. I quickly closed the front door and the windows, recycling the motions of years prior. I was shutting the back door when I noticed something that chilled me colder than the weather ever could. My father was standing at the trailhead, his naked body a pale blue. He was waving, and there was a large, somewhat twisted smile on his face. There was something off about the way that he was standing, but I couldn't place it. A trail of red footprints ran from the back porch, and when I shouted at him to get into the house, he didn't respond. He just continued to wave. I was pulling on my boots to run out to him when something caught the corner of my eye. Something long and disjointed. It was just beyond where the moonlight illuminated the tree line. It was then that my father slumped down onto his knees, still waving and smiling, seemingly unaware of his new position, and the creature emerged ever so slightly from the darkness. I could finally see the eyes that had haunted my father. Two white reflections gazing at me from a height that would have been impossible for any human. It was exactly as my father had described. Pale, limbs that looked like branches, joints that looked like wood knots. I heard a low groan over the snow, and the creature emerged a little further. My father lurched forward into the snow. He was now face down, his arm was still waving. The creature's head resembled a wooden horse skull. It was bare of any flesh, but home to an uneven row of sharp teeth. Steam flowed out of its mouth into the cold air. Something wet dripped from its teeth. I only ever saw its arms and head. I couldn't move, and I can't remember if it was due to fright or just the grotesqueness of it all. The furnace kicking back on brought me back to reality. I blinked for what felt like the first time in a while, and I realized that the morning sun was low in the sky. The back door was shut and locked, though I hadn't closed it, and I was wearing a single snow boot. The footprints were no longer there, and there were no puddles of melted snow under any of the windows. For a long time, I tried to convince myself that it was all just a very bad dream, but I can't hide from it anymore. In the years since the incident, I've sold most of the farm to people looking to build houses. I have no desire to run a farm anymore. Recently, the new neighbors have been asking me if I've seen anything strange in the woods. That one of their kids was sure that something was watching them from just beyond the tree line. Something moving in the darkness. I know that there's something in that forest. Something that has waited 10 years, waiting for just the right snowfall to come so that it can strike, and there's nothing that I can do to stop it. I gave them what information I have about the woods. I told them what I've seen, but they're from out of town and have probably filed me away as a crazy local. That's fine. I did my due diligence. I'm renting out my house this winter so that I'm not here for it, because it is coming.